There is an old adage many of us know and have heard before that in polite company, one never talks about religion or politics, right? We know in polite company that those issues are rather divisive and that to talk about religion and politics might lead to conflict or argument or some struggle with each other. I know growing up in my family, it was not a particular subject, religion and politics. Not that it was something we avoided, but we never really talked about those two issues. I don't, to this day, know what my dad's political point of view was, and his religious beliefs, I think, had more to do with the golf course than the church. But, and my mother, I know that she was passionately Presbyterian. I know she had shared that she was a rather complex person because she had shared she'd worked on Nixon's campaign, but she was also this rather radical feminist for her time. If she wasn't a suburban mom, she probably would have been burning bras out in the streets. But it wasn't necessarily a subject that one spent a lot of time talking about with family, with friends. That wasn't my experience growing up. These days, I think it's hard to find a space or place in which both those subjects don't come up constantly. One has to only look at certain social media platforms to see people arguing back and forth both on religion and on politics, lobbing bombs at each other, so to speak. It seems to be a constant part of our national dialogue in the media. It seems like we can't escape the subjects of religion and politics. And if your family is much like mine, I find myself sometimes trying to navigate, when we have family gatherings, trying to navigate these landmines about talking about religion or politics. I find myself watching my step rather gingerly so that I don't say something that someone else might find offensive. And that can be very difficult. We might try something as mundane in conversation about, well, most recent episode of Dancing with the Stars. That seems pretty safe, right? Or just the weather, right? I can share, that's a safe topic. I can say, we're having a warm winter, aren't we? Well, I discovered that landmine when they asked me, are you talking about global warming? And I don't know about you, but I think there's a number of surveys, a number of indicators in our society and culture that this discussions about religion and politics, this sense of divisiveness, this sense of not being able to connect beyond our divisiveness on religion and politics, has led to a sense of despair, if you will. Anxiety about the future. Is there ever anything that we can hold in common depending on our partisan groups? There's a loss of hope, in a way, that we can move forward as a society, as a church, as a country. And I'll tell you, we preachers find ourselves being very careful in preaching on religion and or politics. And then we have our story this morning. Jesus is at the temple, and the Pharisees come to him and ask him and say, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he asks for a coin, and as Steve illustrated in the young church, he asks what image is on that coin. And they say Caesar, and he says, well, return to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Simple enough. Avoided the question in a sense, and they wander off amazed at his answer. Now, a common interpretation, a modern interpretation, probably an appropriate interpretation of this text, would take our modern idea about the separation of church and state and say, that's what Jesus is illustrating here, is the separation. Give to the government what is the government's, and to give to the church what is the church. And in many ways, that's an appropriate interpretation of that text, except it's always a danger when we take modern ideas, the separation of church and state, which really didn't appear until about 250 years ago, and apply it to the context of Jesus' life in the society and culture in which he lived in. I mean, the idea of separation of church and state, in which the government does not embrace one particular religion over another, does not institutionalize one faith over another, is a very important and vital part of our democracy. And we ignore that separation at our own peril. But the truth is, for Jesus in his time, that idea would be foreign. There was no separation of religion and politics. They were integrally related. And so an interpretation in which Jesus seems to be pointing that, appropriate, but in many ways it misses the point, or it makes too simple the point Jesus is making. Because there's something far more subtle going on here. Far more difficult to grasp. Because the story begins, the Pharisees come with a group called the Herodians. I don't know if you noticed that. You're probably thinking, who are these Herodians? Well, they were a political party. They were a religious party who supported the empire's rule. And the Pharisees and this Herodian group, come to Jesus and they think they can trap him. Now they open up with this line about, well, we know you seek the truth according to God, and that one of the things about you, it was really interesting, is that you're not particularly partisan. That you treat people, everybody, the same. So they seem to be complimenting him, but then they present him with a question that means he will have to choose a side. If he says, pay Caesar, he's supporting the empire. If he says, do not pay taxes, he's supporting those who revoke, who push against that empire. So in many ways, they compliment him on a sense in which he doesn't particularly choose sides, but they want him to choose a side now. Be partisan. And so it appears that he's kind of choosing the empire. He says, whose image, he says, is on this coin? Whose image is there? Caesar's? Well, return to Caesar what is Caesar's, and return to God what is God. And what is subtle and interesting about this text is that the Greek word for image here evokes for those who were there the image of God told in the story of Genesis. That in essence, when he talks about that image, he's talking about the story that all human beings, the Genesis story is all human beings are made in the image of God. Every human being is made in that image. And so, in a way, Jesus responds and tricks them by saying, well, here is this image made of the coinage. And yet, the most in subtle way, he's saying the image of God, everybody belongs to God. No matter which partisan side you choose. That what's important, he says here, isn't your question about taxes, but an assertion that every human being is made in God's image. Even you Pharisees, you Herodians, you tax collectors, you prostitutes, you poor people, you rich people, you conservatives, you liberals, no matter what Jesus is saying, you bear the image of God. And I think we've, in many ways, forgotten that basic truth, haven't we? Let me give you an example. Emmanuel Levinas. I've talked about him before. He's a Jewish philosopher who lived in the mid-20th century. He was a French Jewish philosopher. He, during World War II, was captured and put in a concentration camp. And it was in that concentration camp that he developed a really interesting kind of way of looking at the world, the way of understanding philosophy. And what was important to him was that here he was in this concentration camp, and it wasn't questions about being or existence that really drove him. What was the most important questions was, how do I treat my brother and sister? How do I treat the people around me? Not only those who are my fellow prisoners, but how do I behave towards and treat the very soldiers who have imprisoned me? And he developed this philosophy of ethics in which he said, and again, very much rooted in his Jewishness, is that every human being bears the image of God in them. That otherness of God that is beyond our contemplation, beyond our sense of grasping. Therefore, we are called to honor and love and serve every other human being. Because when we encounter them, we encounter God. What would our world be like? What would our society be like if we honored the image of God in each other? What would it be like? If we honored the image of God not only with each other, but honored the image of God in a person of a different faith. Jesus doesn't say, well, you have to be Christian for me to honor the image of God in you, or Jewish, or religious at all. Jesus is saying we are all made in God's image, and we all belong to God. Jesus isn't saying, well, I'll honor the image of God if you agree with me, or you support my point of view. Instead, he's saying you are called to honor the image of God in each other. Called to honor the image of God in a person of color, different from ourselves. To honor the image of God in a person no matter where they were born. Called to honor the image of God even when you disagree profoundly with each other. And it is only then that we begin to truly see, when we do so, that we truly see the shalom, the peace that passes all understanding. There's a story I read. Let me see if I can get their names right. Teacher named Jean Thompson. She was a good teacher. That's a story she tells. She was a good teacher, but like all teachers, and I know this may be a shock to hear, she had some students who were her favorites and some students she really struggled to connect to, found very difficult to connect to. Did y'all realize that there's teachers here? I'm sure they wouldn't admit it in public, but I'm sure there were a number of times in which I wasn't my teacher's favorite as well. But Jean Thompson tells the story of one young student. His name was Terry Stoddard, that she really had a hard time connecting to. In fact, found herself in many ways disliking. He was a kid who who wore kind of dirty clothes, the same set of dirty clothes every day, hair kind of unwashed, and there was a waft of an odor that came with him. And he would often just be not paying attention to class. He'd be disruptive, and when she'd ask him questions, he'd kind of be more of monosyllabic response. And she really struggled and found herself struggling with seeing the image of God in this child. And she shares in the story, I'm a teacher, I should have gone back and looked at his record, and I would have noticed something. His record would have said, first grade, this is a bright kid, very engaged in class, good kid, very pleased to have this young man, this Terry Stoddard, as as a student. And then you'd look at the record on second grade, and you begin to notice that there are some problems. And Terry is still a good kid, kind of falling behind the other kids. What we should know is that Terry's mother is very ill. In third grade, Terry is a very angry child, unable to pay attention in class, unable to engage, and is very unpopular with the other kids. Terry's mother passed away. When Jean saw that school record, she was ashamed, because she did not know the child. And Christmas was coming around, Jean shares in this story, and all the kids brought their presents for their teachers. And Terry brought a present, and all the kids' presents were wrapped in beautiful wrapping paper with bows. But Terry's gift, this young child, was wrapped in newspaper, kind of scotch taped together. And so when Jean opened that present, what fell out was this rather cheap bracelet and a perfume bottle half filled. And the kids kind of twittered at seeing this strange gift. And so she held it up, but then she realized, she says, well, can you explain your gift to me, Terry? And he said, well, that's my mother's. Well, what she did was she decided, rather than dismiss the gift, she put the bracelet on and poured on some of the cheap perfume and tried to guide the rest of the kids to appreciate what he had offered. And the kids followed her lead. And at the end of that class, Terry came to her and said, thank you for wearing my mother's bracelet and wearing her perfume. Seeing that bracelet and smelling that perfume reminded me of my mother. So Jean shares the rest of that year. She was so intentional to reach out to Terry and the other kids, others dismissed, strange and odd. She did her best to help Terry, understanding his humanity. Many years later, she received a letter in the mail. It was a note said, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I want you to be the first to know I'm graduating from high school. Yours sincerely, Terry." About 4 years later, she received another letter. It said, "Dear Miss Thompson, I want you to know it wasn't easy. I want you to be the first to know I'm graduating from the university. Love, Terry." Then a number of years later, she receives another letter. It says, "Dear Miss Thompson, it was hard, But I got through graduate school, signed Terry, MD. And then a few years later, she received one more letter. Dear Miss Thompson, I'm getting married. I would like for you to come and sit. My father passed away, and I have no family. But I would like you to come sit in my mother's place. Signed, Love, Terry. And she went to that wedding and experienced the shalom of God. And this day now, Terry is Jean Thompson's only family. We are family. All united by the truth that we are all created in the image of God. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.